Hello, everyone. Frank Hartman here from Biblical Mastery Academy. I wanted to talk to you all today about a very common roadblock that I have found, not only through my own teaching of Hebrew, but even back when I was learning Biblical Hebrew, and that is the Hebrew verbal system. It seems like no matter what grammar you're studying through, whether on your own or in a seminary, it seems like as you start to learn the verbal system of Hebrew, there just seems to be so many hills to conquer that perhaps yourself or perhaps you know people who have essentially said, okay, that's enough. I can't take this anymore and I need to give up. And I don't want you to give up. I want you to persist because it is learnable. Might be a little harder than what you're used to, perhaps in some living languages, like European languages like German and French and Spanish, and they all have their challenges in their verbal systems too. In fact, English, if it's not your natural language, is one of the hardest verbal systems to learn with all of its different tenses and things. And so I just wanted to talk to you today about the Hebrew verbal system and recognize some of the challenges of the verbal system. But I also want to present to you some of the ways that these can be overcome so that you can learn the Hebrew verbal system. And by and large, that is the largest chunk of Hebrew to learn. If you can learn the Hebrew verbal system, you're two-thirds of the way there. Look in any Hebrew grammar. You'll see at least two-thirds of the chapters are related to the verbal system and its aspects. So if you can learn the Hebrew verbal system, you can learn Hebrew. And I want to just help you with that today. So first of all, let's recognize that the Hebrew verbal system is a complex system. It is very different from Indo-European languages. It is a Semitic language, and so it has its own style and its own foundations that it's going to rely on. And biblical Hebrew verbs are highly inflected. What that means is that there are going to be conjugations where we add things or change things on the end of the verbs to indicate gender, person, number. There are also some conjugations where we're going to add or remove things to the beginning of the verb. And after that can be highly complex to memorize and to be familiar with what changes where at the start of the verb, at the end of the verb. And um, then we also have this very foreign concept of stems in Hebrew, which is not a foreign concept in Semitic languages like Arabic and others, but it is a bit of a foreign concept when it comes to the normal Indo-European derived languages like Greek and French and German and others, and so and English for that matter. So this is the complexity of what we're doing with the verbs to show person, gender, number, aspect, mood, passivity or activity. These can be very daunting to people, and so we want to recognize that it is a complex verbal system. Also, unlike English, which has a traditional present, future, and past tense, Biblical Hebrew is aspect tensed. Now, that's unlike modern Hebrew, which derives from European languages when they created it in the 19th and 20th centuries. But biblical Hebrew is aspect based. And so we can see different tenses, if you will, or conjugations, as I prefer to call them, to avoid confusion. These different conjugations can be used sometimes in biblical Hebrew to express past tense, but those same conjugations might express a future tense. Same thing with the conjugations that are expressing imperfect aspect. They can be and normally are used to express a future tense, but they're not restricted to that. So this is kind of upside down from many of our tense-based languages, where we see future and past and present and maybe a perfective and that kind of thing. We're not going to see that in Hebrew, and sometimes that can be difficult to learn. Another aspect that we need to take into consideration is that of weak verbs and the phonological changes that accompany them. By phonological changes, what I mean is that literally there are weak verbs, and of course, you know, just like irregular verbs in other languages, the most irregular verbs are the most common verbs, right? To be, to walk, to do all these common things are always the irregular verbs that do these weird things in their morphology. And in Hebrew, it's not really that different in that aspect. So in Hebrew, we have weak verbs, and they usually represent the most common action kind of verbs: to see, to go, to be, and stuff will, by stuff, I mean the letters in the verbs will literally drop off sometimes, or they will change to something else. And this can be very disconcerting to students and say, why is this happening? Well, that's why in Hebrew we call these weak verbs. They're weak. They have some of the weak sounds like a h or a ch or a n. These are phonologically, sound-wise, these are very weak sounds. And of course, we see the same in English, right? If you think of the word immovable, well, why is it immovable? In, as a Latin root, is where we get that. In means to not be, right? But we don't have immovable, we have immovable. How does that happen? Well, because the N there is weak. Same thing happens in Hebrew. So this is very common across many different languages. These weak consonants, these weak phonological sounds contribute to the weakness of verbs. And however, as we're learning these weak verbs, we might be stymied by what has dropped out, what has changed. I don't recognize the verb as I'm reading it. That can be a challenge for us. Another challenge is the Masoretic vowel pointing. So, unlike Greek and many other languages, the vowels are not a part of the alphabet. We have in English A, E, I, O, U, and maybe Y, right? And they are actual components of our alphabet. But in Hebrew, we have no vowels as components in the aleph-bet. So in Hebrew, we call the alphabet the aleph-bet, and we have no vowels there. Instead, what we have is pointings, which are medieval designations to tell us this is the way they said these words. And you learn them like you learn vowels. There's A's, there's E's and I's and O's and U's, but they're not full-fledged vowels as in many other languages. And so that can be off-putting for people learning Hebrew. Another challenge can be the paradigms and the memorizations that are required. So if you've taken almost any foreign language, you've been presented with charts and charts of this is what these verbs look like in this tense. Or maybe they have, if you've taken Greek, right, you have first and second and third declensions, and you have multiple varieties of all these declensions, and you're overwhelmed by trying to memorize all these charts. Well, that can be very off-putting in Hebrew too, because not only are there conjugations in Hebrew that exhibit differences in morphology amongst the different conjugations, but each of those conjugations can appear in different stems. And so that's just more to memorize. And after a while, the Hebrew student starts to say, okay, if you come up with one more variation of a 64 by 64 chart, I'm exaggerating there, but for me to memorize, I'm not going to be able to do it. I can't do it. So that's certainly a challenge to the Hebrew learner. Another challenge can be that of reading and comprehension. What I mean by that is that what are we going to read? As we're reading Hebrew, what are we going to read? Well, our corpus in Hebrew is very small, predominantly it's the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Well, that wasn't written to beginning readers, right? You're not able to just read Dick and Jane went up the hill, or that would actually be Jack and Jill. But, you're not able to read elementary level Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible expects you to be able to read Hebrew because it was written to actual Hebrew speakers and readers. So you're getting the full-fledged complexity in the Hebrew Bible. Yes, there are easier books to read, like Jonah and Ruth and others that are more reader friendly than, say, something like the poetry of Job, which is very challenging. So, but none of them were written to elementary readers. And so even as the Hebrew student starts to learn the verbal conjugations and the verbal stems, they go to practice reading, and they're reading some hard stuff. So that can be a real challenge, and something that would cause the student to say, I can't do this. I understand the concepts. I understand the grammar concepts behind these. I've got my vocabulary down. But as soon as I open my Hebrew Bible, I get stuck. And I'm just looking up word after word in the dictionary, and I don't recognize the parsing of the verbs. I'm frustrated. I'm just going to give up. So that is certainly a challenge. Another well-known challenge for the Hebrew learner is the lack of cognates. As I kind of alluded to earlier, Hebrew is a Semitic language. And so outside of some very commonly known correlations, hallelujah. Okay, most of us know that. Shalom, most of us know that. Adonai, most of us have heard something like that. But really, for the most part, the most common cognates for the most common verbs do not equate equally to English cognates, if that's your native language, and or even German or French cognates, if that happens to be your native language. Uh, Greek is much friendlier on that, right? We've got mega and micro and others that people can see, oh, okay, that's a Greek cognate, and I can bring it across to English or other European languages. I see what there are. There's Latin cognates that come across to English really well. Of course, there's German and French cognates that come along to English very well because of the history of those languages. So, rendezvous, I don't have to explain that that's a French cognate that came over. Um, those kind of things. It's reassuring as you're learning these other foreign languages and you see words, vocabulary that are very close to what you already know. That's reassuring. You don't get that as much in Hebrew because unless you're an Arabic speaker or somebody who knows a Semitic language, you're not going to find a lot of cognates. So part of the challenge of vocabulary is, how do I link that up? And the way the human mind works is that we take new knowledge and we link it to old knowledge. It's pretty well understood that that's how we learn things, not just by a database full of vocabulary, but that we link things to what we already know. That can be a challenge for Hebrew because we don't have direct correlation between this new vocabulary word, halach, and walk or go in English. It's just, how do I put those two together? You have to be very creative as you're learning the vocabulary of particular Hebrew words. And finally, we have to admit that there is a broad cultural and historical context gap between where we live today and the way we express things today versus the way the biblical writers express things in their time, in their historical context. So as we're learning Hebrew and we learn vocabulary and we learn the system of Hebrew, we have to understand this is an ancient language, far older than English, far older than German or French or Spanish, which derives back to Latin, which is newer, younger than Hebrew. So we're trying to bridge this cultural and historical gap when we're trying to learn the language. And that can be an impediment because we just don't see why you would use that word for this action. And if there's not, again, there's not a connection in our heads, we're not going to remember it. We're not going to learn it. And that can be a impediment to our learning. Okay, so enough with the problems. We have plenty of them. So you're interested in learning Hebrew. You want to be able to read your Old Testament in its original language, whether that's for personal growth, whether that's for because you're a pastor and you took Hebrew at one time and you just you just took the tests and got the grade and moved on and you never really practiced it. But now you feel like, okay, I want to learn the language better so that I can exegete it better and so that I can make better sermons because I understand the original language better. And so, or maybe you're a Sunday school teacher and you want to learn it better so that you can teach your students better. So clearly, there's a lot of good reasons to learn biblical Hebrew. And so, how do we do that? How do we overcome some of these challenges? Well, I can only speak from the way we approach that at Biblical Mastery Academy. And one of the things that we use at Biblical Mastery Academy is that we do things in small, consistent steps. It's part of our mantra of how we teach biblical languages, whether Greek or Hebrew. But one of the things we want to focus on is incremental learning. So how do we deal with these verbal system problems? Well, we gradually introduce verbal forms. And we start with the most regular and common forms, the strong forms, as I'm just using the Hebrew term usually, the strong verbs. We go with teaching, here's what the standard is. Here's what you can expect as you learn the verbal system. And then we move once you know the verbal system, the strong expected morphology of the basic verbal system, then we move on to the weak verbs. And we spend an entire third of our coursework in the weak verbs because, one, they're the most common that you'll end up reading, but also because once you know the strong verbs, once you know the way that the basic verbal system works, the weak ones are not that hard to learn because each one is just going to be a slight derivation from that. So, in English example, if I have more than one pot, I have pots. If I have more than one dog, I have dogs. But if I have more than one child, I have children. Wait a minute. I don't have childs, I have children. Well, why is this not a problem for English speakers to deal with? Because you understand that child is not pluralized with childs. It's pluralized with a slightly different form. If you want to call this, let's say it's a weak form. It's just different. It comes from somewhere else. And so, but this is not a problem that you cannot overcome. Well, in Hebrew, weak verbs are not a problem you cannot overcome. Once you learn the basics of the language and how it handles plurals and aspects and those kind of the stems, once you learn the basics, then we present the outliers to that, and you can see how they slightly derive. They're slightly different, just like children is slightly different from dogs, right? So the other thing that really helps is that we emphasize contextual practice. So one of the things we do is provide reading exercises that are graded, and by graded I mean made easier based on where you are in the course. We don't throw heavy, difficult reading at you. Right from the start when you're still learning some of the basics of the Hebrew language. We give you easier things to read. They're still all from the Bible. They're still all from the Hebrew Bible, but they've been reduced in complexity and vocabulary because we want you to feel success as you're reading through that. So you're reading in context. And as you do that, your reading will improve in pace. It will improve in vocabulary and recognition. And the more you see in context these verbs working, what I like to call in the wild, right? It's one thing to learn vocabulary lists, but it's another thing to see these actual words in the wild, in their native environment. And the more you see that, the more you will succeed at reading them and picking up their meaning and reinforcing that you're actually learning this language. Another aspect that we emphasize here at Biblical Mastery Academy is pattern recognition. And what I mean by that is that instead of loading you up with matrix after matrix of paradigms that you need to memorize so that you know all the person gender numbers of all these different verbs, that is not conducive for most people. I'm going to grant that some people learn great that way. But most of us who learn languages don't learn great from memorizing spreadsheets, which is essentially what those are. What we do, and this is the way we learn our natural languages, is we recognize patterns. Again, as I said earlier, when we learn things, we add what we learned to what we already know. And so pattern recognition is important for this. So the way we teach Hebrew is that you recognize the patterns that are indicating what stems these verbs are in, or what conjugations these verbs are in. Are they expressing something that's in a particular conjugation, like the perfect, the imperfect, or the imperative? How do you know? Because you see the pattern. And so pattern recognition is going to save us from having to memorize loads and loads of paradigms. Now I'll admit, we do have to memorize a couple paradigms, the foundational paradigms, because you got to start from somewhere. But once you have a very small set of paradigms understood, memorized, you can quote them from memory. The rest of the bulk of the verbal system is very easy to understand and derive, and you see what's going on. You see why this looks different than that, because you understand pattern recognition, and that's something we focus on in our teaching. Another element that we emphasize in Hebrew teaching is that of mnemonics and memory aids. So when we're learning vocabulary, for instance, I mentioned earlier, the lack of cognates kind of gets in the way many times of us learning vocabulary and systems, because we're dealing with a different root of the language history tree than what we're used to in the Indo-European languages. And one of the things that really helps is mnemonics and memory aids. So adding that kind of link to take something strange, link it to something more familiar, is really helpful. And we emphasize that as we teach Hebrew. So I hope I've been able to present to you some honest, legitimate hardships, difficulties that I have heard from Hebrew students, that I've experienced with Hebrew students in my teaching, as well as looking back to when I learned Hebrew for the first time. And these are not illegitimate concerns. However, they're also not insurmountable concerns if we approach them the right way. By presenting these different methods of teaching, it is our hope at Biblical Mastery Academy to be able to equip you to learn the biblical languages. And if you would like to participate in that, I invite you to follow the links that are presented here to be able to join our biblical Hebrew community. It's a very vibrant, active Hebrew learning community, and I would invite you to be a part of that if learning biblical Hebrew is a priority in your future.